it's not going to just magically disappear, if ever, depending on the loss. It'll soften.
Yes.
And I think we need to keep normalizing people's grief experiences because you're spot on about the fact that everybody grieves differently, even in a family unit.
Mhm.
And just because your sibling is grieving one way and you're grieving another doesn't make their way wrong. It's not your way or the highway. It's not black or white. You and I know that to our core. It's messy. It's different for everyone. So honor what feels right for you, but don't judge what feels right for somebody else.
This is the Life with Grief podcast, the podcast that talks about and normalizes the complexities of grief, life after loss, and all this entails, and so much more. I want you to think of this podcast as a safe space where I'm a friendly face and we're just journeying through this together to figure out how to live life with our grief in tow. I'm your host, Tara Accardo. I'm a grief and transformational life coach, and I'm here to serve you guidance, support, tangible coping tools, inspiration, and some laughs along the way to help you cultivate a more meaningful, intentional, and beautiful life. But grieving or not, we're getting into countless topics here on the podcast, from coping with loss to self-development and so much more. I'm so grateful you're here. Let's dive right in. Hey y'all, welcome back to the Life with Grief podcast. I'm your host, Tara Accardo. You guys, I am so beyond honored to share today's guest with you. I was connected with her through Instagram when I first started following her early in the days of Losses Become Gains. And I just absolutely fell in love with her content and her beautiful writing. And I have no doubt you are going to love her today as well if you do not know who this is yet. Today we are chatting with Michele DeVille. She is a grief specialist, educator, coach, end-of-life doula, which, by the way, we talk about exactly what this is in this episode today, and I am so excited to share that with you as well. And she is also a speaker and writer, so she is truly such a powerhouse. And in this episode today, she not only shares her story with us, which let's just say is profound. She has suffered a lot of loss in her life and different types of loss as well. But really, her message is just so beautiful because, like most of us, she knows how paralyzing grief and loss can be. And it's because of her own painful life experiences that she is dedicated to helping others just like you who are struggling and who are facing some of their most difficult seasons ever. And her and I share the belief that we can't escape loss and grief, but we can choose how we live and love every single day. It all comes down to how we navigate it, how we cope, and how we can shift our perspective. And we have such an empowering conversation about this and so much more here today. So, without further ado, let's get into it with Michele. All right, Michele, welcome to the Life with Grief podcast. I have been looking forward to this conversation for so long. I know we've joked about this. The Instagram gods kind of brought us all together, but it really is just so different and so special when we can really sit down and have a conversation and get to know each other better. But I am so excited for my listeners to get to know you as well, because one of the reasons I reached out to you and I really wanted you to come on was, I mean, your story in and of itself is really deep and you have seen and been through a lot. So I really just want everyone to just hear your story and how you have coped and how you continue to just create such a beautiful community around grief. But really, so much of your content, on social media really speaks to me, and you just word things so beautifully and you just speak so eloquently about grief. But you're so knowledgeable as well. So with all of that combined, I was like, I can't think of a better, can't think of a better guest.
Thank you.
So I really mean that. So I'm so excited to get into this conversation. Very honored to have you here. But what I always like to kind of do too is just have guests tell listeners just a little bit about themselves. I like to say outside of our grief and our losses, but I've caught myself because I'm like, well, who we are can be very much a part of all of that, or like who we are now is sort of a product of all of that. So
True.
feel free to answer this however you would like to, but we'll definitely get to your journey of grief and all of the things specifically, but just who you are and what you enjoy doing and all the good things.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, because you're right. I think when we do this work, we get so wrapped up in it, and it's sometimes hard to separate ourselves from it. And especially if you're kind of on deck to try to help other people, or they're making comments, or they're sending you an email, or you have clients or whatever. So, we can help people no matter where we are, even if we're trying to relax or be on vacation or that type of thing. So I do try to have a life outside of grief. It's not always easy. I find myself not always being probably the most exciting dinner conversationalist, because I always tend to go to the deep stuff.
Mhm.
But no, so my husband and I, big part of my life, we've been together 13 years, married for 8. And I like to share that because we have a beautiful blended family with 6 daughters and now 3 grandchildren, and our dog Charlie. But I always joke around that we are the female version of the Brady Bunch.
Yeah, yeah.
And I always wanted an Alice, and I never got one. So
Who doesn't
uh,
want
I like to share that because that's a huge part of my life. Just an amazing family and friends. But my husband also owns a travel company, so I am blessed to be able to travel all over the world throughout the year, and I love traveling. And my most favorite place so far has been Africa. And
on my list?
people kind of laugh at me that know me, because one of my first jobs out of college, I attempted to be a flight attendant and I got airsick. so
Probably
that
ruled
was,
that out pretty quickly.
yeah, not a good career choice. So obviously I fly and I travel, but I take Dramamine. So
Yeah, yeah.
um, anyway, we have a cabin up north. We spend as much time up there as we can, which with the work that I do, that's kind of my Zen place where I go to get away and relax and catch our breaths. And yeah, I love writing and traveling and a good Netflix show, and, kind of do the normal thing outside of grief. Love hanging with my friends. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little bit
Beautiful.
about me.
I live vicariously through you. I know when we've talked a bit offline, you're like, oh, yes, I'm traveling. I'm like, what is traveling anymore? I can't go anywhere with my newborn right now.
I know.
I was like, one day eventually again.
One day it'll
Such,
come back.
yeah, yeah. But Africa's on my list, so I'm very envious.
It's
Um,
amazing. It's life-changing. It really is.
yes, yeah. Speaking of life-changing experiences, yeah, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
So beautiful. Well, thank you for that quick little intro.
Yeah.
And again, I know, like I said, there's so much of our life can be intertwined with our grief. And that is, I mean, call this a Life with Grief podcast, right? Like
Right.
I just love really trying to inspire people that we can still have a
Mhm.
beautiful, full, vibrant, adventurous life with our
Yes.
loss, after loss, with our grief, all the things. And first of all, everything you just said, there is a beautiful example of that.
Mhm.
But so as I mentioned, we'll get into your grief specifically. So I would, whatever you're comfortable sharing, would love for you to just tell a little bit about your story and just, eventually I'd love to get into the work that you do, but I feel like
Sure.
most of us in this grief space don't get into it because we haven't gone through something hard. So,
Right. Right.
yeah. So whatever you're comfortable sharing about your background there.
Yeah, I think there's power in sharing our stories. Not only is it therapeutic, and even years later, I think if people are honest, we need to and we like to share our story a little
Yes.
bit. And the other thing is, it gives other people empowerment to share their stories, because so oftentimes we don't, right? So I'm happy to kind of share a story and a little bit of backdrop. But I've had a lot of losses over the years. And I always, mention my first big loss, because we all have one. eventually everybody's going to have that first big loss that kind of
Ooh,
comes out of
loss
nowhere and
quote.
knocks you to your knees.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you don't even know what grief is when that
Mm-hmm.
happens.
Yep.
And my first big loss, I was 17, um, and my best friend was killed in a car accident. And I also happened to be in the hospital with an emergency appendectomy when that happened. So that kind of complicated everything. And luckily, they released me to go to the visitation and the funeral. And then I had to go back to the hospital. But I mention this loss because I didn't know it at the time, but it changed me so much as a person. And I believe looking back now kind of laid a foundation to eventually lead me into doing some of this work. And, back then there were no resources, there were no
Mhm.
podcasts, there were no good grief books, there were no guidance counselors waiting in the school gym when we all went back to school. And it was a really dark, dark, lonely time for me. So, um, looking back on that, I didn't think I was going to come through that. I didn't even know what grief was. If I'm honest, I had moments where I just, as a young 17-year-old, wanted to just join him. I'd spend hours at the cemetery. I mean, it truly was a dark time,
Wow.
and there was little to no help back then.
Yes.
So that kind of set me on a trajectory where I became hyper aware with each and every loss that I went through in the years to come, you know, um, not feeling always supported and comforted with each loss that came. And which is also one of the reasons I do this work, by the way. Um, and so, just like so many of us, I mean, I'm 60. I just turned 60 this past year. And the longer you have the gift of life, the more losses you're going to have. That's just the way it is. And I've lost both my parents at this point, just my mother a year and a half ago, which devastated me. Both my step parents and my first husband was killed in a boating accident on a holiday weekend, and 5 men died. And there was alcohol involved, and it was a horrible accident. We had two little girls at the time. And this loss is very important. I know you mentioned to me interest in disenfranchised grief, and
Yes.
not to jump ahead, but I think this loss is a really good example of that because Scott and I knew each other in high school. We were very, very good friends. He was a huge, huge love of my life. We had girls together. But due to drinking issues and things, we ended up, after several separations, getting a divorce. And I went on to, after a while, remarry. And he died a month after my wedding. So our
Disgusting.
whole world got turned upside down. And I had this new husband who thought he was going to be a part time stepdad, suddenly a full time stepdad. We had these two little kids. And for me, because I was married again, I felt like I couldn't grieve. Um,
Oh, sure.
so I had to hide my grief. I kind of felt like I couldn't really grieve out in the open. And so it definitely fell into the category of disenfranchised grief.
Mhm.
And because, with disenfranchised grief, society doesn't really always acknowledge it, or
Right.
they don't deem it as worthy of grieving for whatever reason. And there's a million different examples of disenfranchised grief, but I didn't even know what that was at the time. All I knew was I felt very alone, very isolated. I had all this grief going on because a marriage doesn't work out, still loved him, father of my kids, codependent with them,
A lot of
caretake, all these
distractors
things.
and brush.
So
Yeah.
I felt widowish, I guess is
Sure.
what I'll call it.
Yeah.
But I wasn't really supposed to be grieving. So that really, really reinforced my belief back then that something's not right here. People should never have to hide their grief. And again, though, I didn't have the education or the knowledge at the time. So my grief really came out sideways with that experience because it was so stuffed and hidden. I never dealt with it really.
Yeah.
Plus, I had these two little girls to worry about their grief and kind of, try to help them through it. Um, so that was a huge, huge life changing event for me as well.
Mhm.
And really, my marriage took a hit and toll
Sure.
when that happened. And then, many miscarriages over the years, which again can fall into disenfranchised grief. Um, People don't understand. It's not talked about. You're supposed to just kind of get over it and move on. Um, and so, really big losses, cumulative grief over the years. I've lost a couple of best friends, one just this January. So, I think what I'd like to say to people when we talk about our stories is grief isn't one and done. I mean, you're going to have losses and you're going to keep having losses. And I think even though every loss will affect you differently, it's really, really important that you acknowledge each and every loss and that you realize there is going to be some element of grieving that comes with those losses, no matter how small or how big they are.
Mhm.
And a big, big pet peeve of mine is every single loss matters. And
Yeah.
so I don't like comparing losses. I don't like when, people think that, somebody has it worse or they have it worse. Or, David Kessler says the worst loss is your loss,
Yep.
the worst grief is your grief.
Yep.
And I agree with that.
Mhm.
And it's important that we acknowledge that and grieve all of
Yeah.
these different losses. So it's kind of a snapshot of my story without getting too deep. But yeah, a lot of loss over the years, for sure. Yeah,
Wow. Oh my gosh. And I want to circle back, and it's interesting, and not to go too in depth here in this particular conversation. This might warrant a part two, but being that, I just can't imagine how complicated that must have felt for you, having just been newly married. You're
right,
supposed to be loving on your new husband and this beautiful new life and all of the things, and like feeling, I see this on Instagram a lot too with other women specifically who have lost partners.
hmm,
And a lot of them are, whether or not there was any overlap, like let's say in their situation, maybe there wasn't a divorce, but there was, like partner died, there was time, and now they're remarrying or they're
yep,
moving forward with their life, which they deserve to do. I
right,
can only begin to imagine there is so much kind of like shame associated with that, or it's like almost like if you're grieving the ex, so to speak,
right,
that meant you love your current partner less or something like that, and that just must be so um like you said, just isolating and very like who can you really trust with those feelings, and then have two sweet daughters on top of it. And
right.
I'm actually curious now that you brought that up. I mean, and again, just high level, but like how did you not only just navigate your feelings, but how did you communicate that experience and that grief, and like how did you work through that with your daughters? I'm just so curious. And also I guess also it's important for context, what ages were they?
Yeah, so they were 6 and 8, when their dad died, and, part of the challenge with that whole situation was it got national headlines. The NTSB stepped in, 2 boats were involved. It was on a holiday weekend. We had reporters, wanting, to talk. I mean, had never experienced anything like that before, and it was a big, big deal. And so, you have these two little girls and a brand new husband. We're all thrown kind of into this ring of chaos, very public chaos. And,
Yeah.
so as far as the girls go, as a mom, you go right into protective mode, right? I didn't want them anywhere around the news or the news crews or anything like that. So I was very protective of that. It was a holiday weekend. So, we tried to create some normalcy. We tried to, shoot off some fireworks and all of those things. But I was on autopilot. We were all in shock. And, they were still searching for him on the 4th of July. They did actually find him on the 4th of July in the river. And so, his picture was all over the news, the newspapers. So when you ask about the girls, um, you know, the hardest conversation I've ever had was to tell those girls what had happened. And, 6 and 8, the 8-year-old definitely understood better. The 6-year-old got it, but, it's just kind of different at that age.
Yeah.
So how I dealt with it with them was really very protective, but very loving, supportive, found some children's books. And, I actually took them to Fairview Youth Grief Services and enrolled them in programs where they had for different age groups. And then one way that I handled my grief, because I couldn't talk about it, was I became a youth grief services volunteer
Oh, that's
and
wonderful.
worked with the teen group. And so, I had to kind of find different venues or different
Like
routes
outlets
to be
kind
able
of.
to,
Yeah.
yeah. And that helped a little bit. But again, I was kind of helping other people. So I still
Mhm.
wasn't really,
Like dealing
processing
with
my own
yours.
grief. Right.
Yeah.
So it was a very challenging time, hands down. And, the girls are doing great, kind of how you mentioned, we can all go on to live full, meaningful, purposeful lives, and we can, and we all have. And that's a beautiful thing, right?
Mhm.
Even though grief will always be there. But yeah, coping wise, I talked to just about anybody that would listen that wasn't directly in my life. So, hairdresser, massage therapist, dental hygienist,
Yeah. Any third
anybody
party
that
you'd
would
be
listen,
curious
I
about.
needed to tell my story. So,
Yeah,
that's
it's
kind of
cathartic.
how I coped. Yeah,
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, and it's so interesting you mentioned that because I just isn't it so ironic that we sometimes feel the least I'm going to use the word safe because I don't have a better word for it right now. But like we feel the least safe and possibly the most judged by the people that are the closest to us sometimes.
for sure.
And it's
Hands down.
like when you say that out loud, how twisted and
I
how
know.
sad is that?
I
You know
know.
what I mean? Because they have stake in it or they, like they're emotionally intertwined in all of this and or like let's say they maybe knew both of you and
Right.
so they have thoughts and feelings about how you should be moving on, which
Yep.
this is also a bigger conversation, but it's just all the more reason that we cannot judge anyone else's grief or anyone else's journey with it or whatever. But it just breaks my heart that in so many ways, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like there's sort of this suffering in silence a little bit that,
Yeah.
you had to turn. I think what you did with it though, I mean, and I actually, this is a perfect segue sort of into how you've gotten into the work that you have now. But so you took on that volunteering opportunity, which is amazing. Most people would not do that. That is not for the faint of heart, I would imagine. Or it just not everyone goes in that direction when they suffer a loss that great, but that's so selfless. So just talk to me a little bit about that experience, and then is that sort of what prompted going into like grief coaching, end of life doula? Like, how did that all come to fruition to
Yeah.
ultimately what you do now?
You know, so Fairview Youth Grief Services had an amazing program. And ironically, my sister, Lisa, worked at that program. So that's kind of how I got connected with that. And I will say it definitely, I think, fulfilled me. I've always had this passion to definitely write, but also help other people make a difference in the world and all those things. I just didn't really know where that was going to take me.
Sure.
You know, back in the day, I had a corporate job, and I really had a corporate job a good chunk of my life, and was kind of doing things on the side for a long time. But that experience just kind of solidified for me that there's so much grief out there, so many people hurting, all ages, all kind of losses, heartbreaking things, and that there's a lot of work to be done. And we need to have people who are compassionate and don't judge in that space, and can create a safe space for people to be able to share and talk and, try to find their path forward. And so I would say, yes, that kind of laid groundwork for the work that I'm doing now, although that was a long time ago. And I got sidetracked again back to being a mom and, trying to help my kids. And, eventually, and I had a corporate job, I had to pay the bills, all this stuff. But it was always in the back of my mind. And so X amount of years ago, I got my life coaching certification, did some of that on the side, even though I was still working for a biotech pharmaceutical company. And eventually started writing heavily. I had written inspirational quotes for years, not grief specific. And then about, I don't know, a few years ago, I just was drawn to the grief space and kept going back to all my experiences and how unsupported and unseen and unheard and lonely I'd felt over the years. And I didn't want other people to feel that way. So I kind of transitioned from life coaching to more grief coaching, and got all these different certifications. And I'm always reading. I have just about every grief book there is in my house. So I'm always reading and learning and listening to podcasts and taking courses. And, I just feel like we're needed. You're needed. I'm needed. Megan Devine's needed. All these people, we have a lot of work to do yet, even though we've come a long ways, from where it was when my friend was killed when I was 17 years old. There's still a lot of work to be done. And so that's why I'm so passionate about it, is we need to change the conversations and, make it okay to grieve and
Yes.
be open,
Hold space
you know?
differently.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's crazy, and how many people are still very hung up on the 5 stages, and I've talked about that in a podcast episode recently, and that has gotten very misconstrued. And so a lot of people, and 5 stages aside, like there's just so much around like, oh, I'm grieving wrong, or there's a lot of like questioning, I think, that often comes up in that process based on
right.
a lot of things, based on how we were raised, based on how we were taught to show grief or not, and comfortability with it. And I get why it's uncomfortable. Like maybe we don't want to break down in the middle of the grocery store. We don't want to like, and
Which I have done,
understandable.
by the way.
Yeah, same. I use that excuse or that example because these are real life examples.
Right,
But yeah, it's something, it's so crazy that like, you mentioned like, we still have a long way to go, even though it's gotten better from when you were younger. It's like the fact that we have that much more to go says a lot. And the fact that it has come a long way, and it's getting a little bit better. But I feel like one of the biggest opportunities in this space, and hopefully this continues to improve, is, I think a lot of people like maybe know they need help, but they don't like feel confident going to get it, or they think that like a therapist is the only way to do that or something, which
right.
no knocks to therapy. I've been to therapy. It's very, very
Yep,
helpful.
me too.
But sometimes you're just, maybe it's not like so much past stuff we need to like deal with. It's just like,
Mhm.
how do I cope with this loss right now in front of me and everything that means for me down the line? It's like that
For sure.
present sort of forward thinking. And for anyone who's kind of like unsure of the difference, that's kind of high level the difference,
Yeah, yeah,
between the two. And that's sort of how I like to interpret it. But one thing that you kind of alluded to and mentioned, and that I think is so great to also bring up is like, of course, and I do talk about death a lot on the podcast, of especially
yeah,
that of a loved one. But, there's so much, and I can only begin to imagine what you went through with this is, we also grieve a life that we thought we were going to have. Like our whole life trajectory could go in a different direction. So,
Right.
and also, and you mentioned you got a divorce. That also is a type of loss to grieve, right? And so
For
and what was so beautiful that you mentioned was just that, losses of all kinds and all shapes and all sizes need and deserve to be recognized. And, I feel like there's so often, let's say, for example, there might be like a death, but then there's like so many countless little nuances and little deaths or little griefs that we have to
Yes.
cope with in between there. And then we catch ourselves wondering, like, why am I not doing well today? And it's like, well, maybe there's there's something to that
Yeah.
that you haven't recognized or coped with yet. And that's where a grief coach, can come in handy.
Right.
Real quick interruption here, and then we'll get back to this episode. If you're someone who is experiencing some form of loss and are trying to navigate the complexities of grief, which you likely are in some capacity if you've stumbled upon this podcast, then this message is for you. If you haven't heard about my Life with Grief membership and community yet, this is truly something you need to check out. This membership is here to guide you into living a deeper, more meaningful, and full life after experiencing loss. Who doesn't want that, right? I created this membership because I know what it's like to navigate and cope with grief on a daily basis, and I know the tools and support it takes to do this effectively. I've done the work myself, and I've coached people just like you to do the same. It comes down to having impactful, effective resources and tools at your disposal, having the right support around you from people who can understand and empathize with your grief, and having encouragement and inspiration around you consistently to not only elicit and spark change, but to keep it and keep the positive momentum going. Enrollment opens once a month for a limited time. Check out the details linked in the description, and I hope to see you in there.
Well, people don't realize that, I think you brought up something I think that's so important. And, when I'm working with a grief client, they don't even begin to connect the dots sometimes that, they're so laser focused on I'm going to call it the primary loss. So,
Yes, yes.
like you said, the death of a parent or the death of a spouse or the death of a child. But this major life event that's changed everything for them, they don't connect the dots that out of that primary loss are so many other losses. And
Yeah.
no wonder people are exhausted and
Mhm.
overwhelmed and have a lot of bad days. And I think you have to sometimes point that out to people and, well, did you think of this? Or, you just shared something with me that actually is another loss on top
Yeah.
of your other loss. And so, there's a lot to sift through. And I think, there's wreckage everywhere after
Yes.
a primary
That's a
loss,
hard word.
that you
Yeah.
gotta kinda sift through and dig through the rubble, and can you get through it? Absolutely. Can you, go on to live a beautiful, meaningful, purposeful life? Yes, it'll be different, but you
Mhm.
can.
Yeah.
And I encourage people to do that, and there's ways to do that. But yeah, there's so many other losses
Yeah.
that come out of, big losses, and
Mhm.
then they just accumulate. And people don't even often have a clue that those things are going on and that
Mhm.
those are also losses that need to be acknowledged and grieved. So
Yeah.
very, very important. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot to be aware of. It's like no pressure, but like,
Right.
there's like,
No
okay, we
pressure.
kind of focused on this main thing, but
Yeah.
then yeah, I just always love calling that out because in with some people that I work with as well or in my membership, they'll be like, yeah, I'm kind of feeling like this way about it, but I don't know why or whatever. And it's exactly like you said. You're like, well, just what about this? Or thinking about it this way, just, mirroring that back to them. And they're like, oh my God, maybe. And, and it unlocks these beautiful aha moments, but that's really what so much of coping with our grief is, right? And I know it's like a continuous process, this whole living life with grief, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a moving forward. It's not a moving on per se, but um, yeah, I think that's just all the more reason that it's so important to just give ourselves all the grace in the world and understand that if we're feeling some type of way, like it was probably not for no reason. So sitting with that and ultimately having the right tools to do that. But that's hard. I always joke, it's like sometimes we have to be our own grief coach in a lot of ways. You know, if you don't literally
For
have a
sure.
coach or you can't have your coach with you 24/7 in the little back of your head,
Right.
you know, so much of that has to come from within us. And that's scary. That can be an intimidating process. And
It
that's,
is
you
scary.
know, hard to do as you're also the one grieving. You're like, oh my God, can I
Right.
get a break?
Well, and I think you mentioned, self-awareness, right? So oftentimes, it starts with being aware.
Yeah.
And some of it is learning more about grief because, all of a sudden somebody's grieving and they have these constant headaches, or they're super fatigued, or they all of a sudden have new GI issues,
Yeah.
or they feel like they're in a fog all the time, or they can't stop crying, or whatever. And
Hmm.
again, people don't always realize that grief impacts you not just emotionally, it's not just sadness and crying, it's also, impacts you physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And so I think, kind of like you said, we do have to be a little bit of our own cheerleader and our own advocate.
Yeah.
To If you don't have a coach on call all
Hmm.
the time, or a therapist, or whatever you're choosing to do, and a lot of people don't do anything, I always encourage people, educate yourself, learn more about grief, because in order to be able to grieve in a healthy way, you have to understand it, and all the different, complicated things that come with it, so that you can find healing and move forward. Otherwise, it's easy to get stuck. And
Yeah.
there are things you can do, tools and coping and all of that. And you asked me how I cope. Really, back in the day, it was, if I'm honest, I didn't cope real well back in the
Hmm.
day because I didn't really understand. I didn't know to connect those dots, just like so many of my clients. And so I did a lot of learning and self educating over the years, because my grief started to come out sideways in
Yeah.
unhealthy ways. And that happens to a lot of people. So all of these things I'm sharing are one of the reasons I'm so passionate about doing the work that I do and shining a light on all of this stuff, so that people are more aware, so that they can get help and give themselves permission to grieve, which is also really important. We have to
Yeah.
give ourselves permission to grieve, regardless of what all the outside world's trying to
Noise.
tell us. Yeah,
And there is a
which is
lot of
crazy.
noise.
Yeah,
Yes.
a lot of noise. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so well said. So I want to shift gears a little bit because you are also an end of life doula. And
Mhm.
this is a term that I think a lot of people either do not know what it is. It feels newer, I think, to a lot
Yep.
of people. Maybe it actually is newer. But can you just elaborate just a little bit on what that is, how you chose to go in that direction amidst all of the other beautiful things that you do as well?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So an end of life doula, and you're right, it is a term that I think is newer, although it's growing momentum. And one of the reasons I looked into getting certified as an end of life doula is, over the years, I've had the gift of being able to be with loved ones when they were dying or actively dying, right up until they took their last breath. And as painful as that is and heartbreaking, it also was this deep, moving, beautiful experience. So,
Mhm.
end of life doulas are kind of similar to birthing doulas, right? They're
Right.
there as a support person through one of the most beautiful, heartbreaking, you know, events and times in life. And that being, terminally ill or dying, and then ultimately death. So, end of life doulas, one of the confusing things, they don't replace hospice care.
Mhm.
I think it's important to know that. Um, but they're an add-on to hospice care. I like to think of it as a bonus to hospice care. So, end of life doulas don't get involved with clinical type decisions.
Right.
They're not administering, medications, anything like that. but they get involved in really cool things. And it really depends on the client and the family. Sometimes they just want a break. Family members who are kind of on the clock 24/7
Yeah.
want respite. They need a break. They need to be able to catch their breath. And so an end of life doula can come in and kind of do bedside vigil so the family can take a break, or they can bring support to the family. End of life doulas are companions. They can help with advanced care planning. They can, be trained to kind of recognize when the end is coming near, so they can kind of bring comfort and support not only to the dying person. You're not alone. I'm here. I think it's a beautiful thing to be involved in. And it really is just being there, offering love, offering support, companionship, right down to holding a hand or giving a hug or listening. When people are dying, sometimes the wisdom is
Mm-hmm.
amazing in those last moments, and you can learn a
Yeah.
lot, and they just want somebody to talk to, you know that maybe isn't quite so emotionally attached, as one
Yes. Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
So
Empathetic, but a compassionate third party in a way.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, I think, high level, but I think it's growing in momentum, and
Mhm.
I think it's becoming a little bit more of a not so much just an idea out here. It's kind of something that more and more people are learning about and becoming more aware of. But still, a lot of education needs to be done because a lot of society doesn't even know what that is. So I
Yeah.
think it's important that, I think it's great that you brought that up.
Yeah. Well, I'm so happy to have someone on the podcast who is one and can speak to it, because I think there's a lot of, yeah, just either unknowing or confusion about what it is. And you gave a beautiful overview of what it is, and I mean, what a gift to feel called to do that. I mean, that is not easy work. I mean, some people would probably hear what you just said and we're like, I am going to go ahead and run for the hills now. In fact, like that is too emotional, very, because I would imagine that is very heavy work. I mean, people joke all the time. They're like, how do you talk about grief and death and everything so often? I'm like, I don't, I just do. I'm
Right.
just here.
Yeah.
But that really takes it to another level, because not only are you around someone who is nearing the end of life, but emotional family members and their grief, and a lot to digest and
Right.
unpack there. But I guess in some ways it's sort of helpful being maybe a third party. You're connected, you're there, you're showing just that love and that empathy that they need, but
Right.
still a little bit removed to where it's, you can still give like level-headed, care and direction,
Right.
to they
Right.
really need it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like the work that you do, the work that I do, end of life doula, hospice workers, chaplains, all of that. I mean, we all have to do self care as well because, you can get emotionally attached, right? We tell ourselves, okay, I'm not going to get emotionally attached, but it's hard not to if
Yeah.
you really connect with a client or you're, connecting with a family whose loved one is dying or the dying person themselves. I mean, so you kind of have to keep that in check a little bit. I just kind of go with my heart, and every connection you have with other people is different. And the biggest thing is, it's one of the most difficult, beautiful times of life
Yeah.
if you can look at it both ways.
Yes, which
And
is
sometimes you
important to
need to
do.
mediate that and
Yeah.
kind of to guide that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a beautiful, I mean, like you said, just like a birth doula, you know what I mean? We're coming in,
Right.
we're going out. Like they both need to
Yeah.
be supported in their own, respective ways. So,
Right.
so,
Right.
so true. Um, okay, so there's just a couple other things that you have that I wanted to touch on your book.
Okay.
So the path to forgiveness, and then you have these beautiful cards as well. So I just wanted you to be able to tell us
Yeah.
like how those two things came to fruition as well, before we start wrapping up, and then I have a couple more questions for you.
Okay. Yeah. So the path to forgiveness, actually, I wrote many, many years ago, and I literally wrote on a napkin this poem. about forgiveness because, again, I think I mentioned I had so much grief in my life from earlier years and I didn't deal with it right. I didn't give myself permission to grieve. I didn't follow what I would tell people to do now.
Right.
And it came out sideways. And, I made a lot of bad choices and mistakes and all these things, and I will own that. And it became about self-forgiveness for me
Mm.
initially when I wrote this poem, because I really was struggling with some things. And then it became about we all have things to forgive, other people to forgive, forgiving ourselves, which can be harder. Um, and so I've written poetry since I was a kid, and I just scribbled out this kind of poem about forgiveness and ended up turning it into this gift book with beautiful, Sean McCann did all the artwork. So it's kind of like a children's book, even though it's not. I mean, it can be for children, but I wouldn't say too young.
Right.
And it's just on up to age 100. It can be a coffee table book. So and, forgiveness can be key when it comes to grief too.
Yes.
So that book
Oh
can
my gosh.
be an important piece alongside grief as well. I do have a book about grief coming out in the fall. It's in editing phase now, and the cover has been
I,
selected. And so I'm super excited about that. All more to come on that in the coming days. But that is going to be about a 250 page, it's a book, and very, very excited about that. The cards, we all go to funerals. We all stop at Walgreens or CVS on the way to the funeral. We run in, we grab a sympathy card, we
Mhm.
write in it quick, we go to the funeral, we drop it off, and then everybody goes back to life.
Yep.
My partner Rachel and I, she did the artwork, I did the writing. I believe that we need to continue to support people who are grieving or going through a difficult time long after the funeral is over. And
Mhm.
it can be other losses too. I'm just giving
Sure.
that as an example. So we created this card line to, send a loved one a card 6 weeks later or a year later or on one of those difficult milestone days.
Yeah.
Have them on hand because people feel alone and unsupported as soon as everybody goes back to their own lives.
Yep.
And it's one of the hardest and loneliest parts about grieving. So that is where that passion came from to develop these cards. And, I just am a big believer in that. Send a note,
Yeah.
drop off a coffee, send a card,
Yep.
buy some flowers. Months later, weeks later, couple years later, don't forget your grieving family and friends because I guarantee they're still grieving.
They're feeling it. Yeah, that does not go away. Right. And like you said, like big milestones might come up, like big, just new chapters and phases of life. Like I've spoken
Right,
about this recently, but like with my daughter now being born, yet my parents died 3, 4 years ago. But
right.
like this is kicking up a whole new range of emotions for me, to say the least.
Absolutely it
And
is.
it's not that, people don't check in with me. They do, but like certainly not like they would in the beginning, right? And
Right, right,
now I'm in a place in my grief and being a grief coach and everything. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to chastise anyone for that. But it's just such a testament to like grief is a nonlinear, never-ending journey. Things are
right.
going to come up, even if someone is getting better or at least
Mhm.
seems to be on paper. You have no idea what they could be going through.
Right,
Colleagues, especially, like I've talked about this like with work and recognizing grief in the workplace, either if you're as a manager or just friend to friend, colleague to colleague, like, having to compartmentalize
right.
all of this. And it's brutal. So for to have someone just small gestures, hey, I'm thinking of you, hey, I haven't forgotten about you, it is
Mhm.
amazing how much you can turn someone's day around. Just
Agreed.
that little touch.
And side note, two things you said that I think are so powerful. That grief in the workplace thing is a huge, huge, huge
That's a whole nother
pet peeve
topic
of
for sure.
mine. That's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm doing some work in that area because it's a mess. I mean,
It's
lot of changes need to happen there.
yep.
And for you, with your little one, which by the way, I'm so happy for you. Um, but you hit on something super important, right? You can be moving forward in life after a
Mhm.
major loss and checking all the boxes and find great coping tools and all these things so that you can go on to find that meaningful, purposeful life. One of them being, in your case, having your child, right?
Mhm.
Um, but other big life events like having a child or getting married or whatever it is
Yep.
can kick up and stir up losses and, grief things that happened years ago,
Yep.
even though you are doing better or you're in a different place than you were when it first happened. So I think that that's another thing that people need to remember.
Yeah.
Like, I do not believe if the loss is big enough, it ends. The grief doesn't end. I
Totally.
believe
Yeah.
we carry it, we integrate it, we can have a good life, all those things. But it's easy for grief to get stirred up even years later, no
Yep.
matter how good your coping tools are. So,
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think it's where I will say it until I'm blue in the face, until it's just more normalized. And that I know is just so much of the work both you and I are doing. And so speaking of coping tools, and just to wrap this up, what
yep.
are maybe just 2 to 3 high level tips or pieces of guidance or wisdom that you would give to anyone listening here today who is dealing with, and this can really be any kind of loss. And I always,
Absolutely.
preface this for anyone listening. I think a lot of people here have likely lost a loved one in some capacity,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
loss has a lot of different faces, as we know. So, just what has helped you? What has helped the people that you've coached? Maybe just 2 to 3 things that you're like, yeah,
Yeah.
these are my go-tos.
Yeah, I think the first one is give yourself permission
Hmm.
to feel and to grieve. I know society often makes us feel like we have to hide our grief or we have to rush through it or we have to, just get over it and move on.
Yeah.
Um, I always tell people don't fall under that pressure.
Hmm.
They don't know you, they don't know your loss, they're not in your shoes. So
Great.
honor your grief no matter what the loss. Give yourself permission to feel all of the emotions that come with it.
Mhm.
Don't try to box in your grief experience or grief journey, or put a timeline on it. You don't get over it really. You learn to live with it.
Yep.
You don't move on necessarily, nor do you have to. You just learn to move with it. So,
Yep.
those are kind of, I think some of the most important things for people to remember is, and then ask for help, you know,
Yes.
surround yourself with people who do get it, even though they don't walk in your shoes. There are a lot of people out there that they are going to support you without judgment or unrealistic expectations. And take care of yourself. Give yourself grace. Our bodies and minds and hearts take a beating after
Mhm.
loss. Be aware of that and make sure you're taking care of yourself. Say no, change your mind, set
Yep.
boundaries, give yourself grace. So,
Yes. And when other people don't give it to you, because there are going to be times, as you are painfully aware, and probably a lot of people here listening, where you are not going to get grace from people, or
right,
there will be a lot of judgment, either from people close to you or some people kind of removed from you, or complete strangers in some
right,
cases. But I think,
absolutely
just to reflect on something you just said, you're just like, people do not know your grief. And like, no one lives in our heads rent free unless we let them. So, and no one knows what's going on in here. And I always say, like, let's say in the example of like two siblings, right? You might lose the same parent in
Mhm.
theory, right? But you process it different, or it can affect one person differently or whatever. So I think to everyone just remembering, like, grief can look very different to a lot of people.
Mhm.
Yes, to a degree, there's very much like there's no right or wrong way to grieve, right?
Right,
But there
right,
are definitely times where I think you kind of touched on this too. You're just like, I wasn't really grieving all of that, right? Like I wasn't
yeah,
the
Yeah.
right coping tools. And so I think for me today, definitely in our conversation, like big takeaway too is just that self-reflection and really giving ourselves time to see our grief. And I tell people all the time, I'm like, literally give yourself 5 or 10 minutes, just as you would to take a shower or journal or something, to like sit with your grief for a
Right.
hot second and like
Yeah.
see what it's,
Yeah.
bringing up for you. Because with, if we don't give it the time it's looking for, as you
Mhm.
know, like it's gonna figure out a way to make itself known one way or another. So
Yeah.
we may as well excruciatingly embrace it, by the skin of our
You
teeth.
you you can't outrun grief, right?
No.
And, people it's counterintuitive, I know, because, we learn our whole lives, well, I don't wanna be in pain or I don't wanna hurt, so we try to avoid it. But
Yeah, fair enough.
you can't it will find you. It
Yeah.
will catch up to you, and so I like what you said, and I'm a big believer in it, take a hot second and sit with your grief, sit with your pain, acknowledge it, see it, hear it, touch it, feel it, because it's not gonna just magically disappear, if ever, depending on the loss.
Yeah.
It'll soften,
Yes.
and I think we need to keep normalizing people's grief experiences because you're spot on about the fact that everybody grieves differently, even in a family unit.
Mhm.
And just because your sibling is grieving one way and you're grieving another doesn't make their way wrong.
Right.
It's not your way or the highway. It's not black or white. You and I know that to our core. It's messy. It's
Mhm.
different for everyone. So honor what feels right for you, but don't judge what feels right for somebody else.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Mic drop. Like that's so cliche, but like what what a beautiful way to end this episode. I'm just gonna end it right there because that was just so good. It was like it's so accurate, so true. So I really hope anyone listening today walked away not only with just like a lot of lessons and things to think about, but just, a reassurance that like your grief is yours, someone else's is theirs, but we can come together and
Mhm.
talk about it, and it can be cathartic, and we don't have to put this wall up or assume that we don't need the help if we're feeling off someday or whatever. I mean, grief runs deep.
It
Runs
runs deep,
very
and
deep.
it's okay. It's okay. It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
It's
And like
okay.
with cumulative losses too, like you said, like, again, depending on how many losses someone here listening might have, like just being wary of that too. I mean, one great loss or really just the loss of any size, right, can affect us in various times throughout our life, but like then add on more things that we go through, even loss and grieving unmet expectations and all of these things that, it's like these little griefs that we just go through day to day.
Exactly.
Like it does take a lot of like introspection and that time to self-reflect.
Right.
So
Yeah,
um
reflections. I like that word. Reflection's important.
yeah.
I mean, as you and I are seeing, we could probably talk for 9 hours,
Yes.
and because there's so many different topics and ways this can go and different kinds of losses and different types of grief and different people and cultures, and I mean,
Oh my
it's
gosh.
fascinating to me, really.
Me
And so
too.
I
Yeah.
like I said, I'm not always an exciting dinner conversationalist, and if I want to sleep on the plane instead of talk to somebody, alls I have to tell them is what I do, and they put their
You're like, I'm
headphones
gonna
on,
I'm
so
gonna go ahead and look out the window now. It's so good. I love it. Well, I at least very much enjoyed this conversation. I
it
have
was
no
great.
doubt everyone listening, I feel like we hit a lot of bases here. So,
Yeah,
like I said, lots to think about.
yeah.
But if anybody wants to get in touch with you or find your amazing content like I did, or work with you or any of the good things, your book, cards, where can they find you?
So I have a website, Michelle with one L, DeVille.com. You can find me on Instagram at Michelle DeVille, where I write every day. Or my Facebook page for grief and loss is Dare to Grieve. So those are the best ways to find me. If somebody wants to email me, grief@michelledeville.com. And I'm just here to help, like you, and to normalize grief and make a difference out in the grief space. And I'm so, so happy and honored to connect with you because I think you're wonderful and you're doing amazing work out there.
Thank
So
you so much.
thanks
Well,
for
that goes
having me.
both ways. Yes. Like I said, I'm honored to have you here and just so grateful and inspired very much so by the work that you do as well.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for a beautiful conversation. Thank you everybody for tuning into this today. And by the way, all of that you just mentioned will also be linked in the show notes for everyone. So thank you
Great.
so much for your time today, Michelle. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was awesome. Take care.
I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps you are taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog, ways to work with me, to shop my daily journal, and so much more. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Life with Grief Podcast. I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your stories, and supporting you however I can. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you haven't left a rating or review, please do so. I would so appreciate it. Or if you feel so inclined to share this episode or this podcast with someone who could use it too. I'll catch you in the next episode.